Hello, Professor Wagendorf. This is Dave Powell. This is my midterm exam, so let's get started. Morel is one of his theory. Morel in one of his theories suggests that space is always a blight, subjectively optimized. How has the physical geography of Michigan made this optimization of space easier or more difficult? Is regional optimization also impacted by time or periods? Now, thinking of key points before we answer this question is, one, home rule. Township and county government make their own laws and run their town by that. And then we also got to look at local and internal optimizations, decentralization, centralization, sprawl, and urban developments. Generalization B, place identity, meeting places have different values and meaning to place. Generalization C, conflict over space. Generalization D, inequality in space and power decisions. Generalization E, optimum space usage, balance and trade-offs of using space, which also correlates to distance decay. And now one of my first answers was more difficult to optimize space in Michigan. One being due to sprawl. We are having large amounts of farmland turning into urbanization. One being the new outlet mall that we built in Byron Center in Grand Rapids, and we are also seeing this in many cities across the United States. Sprawl really does not optimize the land because you're building infrastructure further out from the city core, and you are ultimately losing productive farmlands to it. And because of this, we are becoming more car dependent, having more car dependent communities. And suburbanization. Having car dependent communities, you have to drive further to the grocery store, you have to drive further to go to doctor's office, park, school, whatever. Which ultimately is, having a waste of space. And optimization of space is more difficult that way to make more productive space, which is also a transition to distance decay. And then we have less optimization of land uses, meaning we're not getting those productive farmlands. We're building infrastructure way further out than we need to, as opposed to building optimally on top of one another through air rights and building skyscrapers and optimizing land as much as possible, as opposed to what we are doing now in the United States by suburbanizing, spreading out the land, and spreading out infrastructure, which ultimately costs us a lot more money. And then we also face environmental justice issues in terms of, especially in Detroit and Grand Rapids, where we are seeing food deserts. We are seeing lack of parks per acres in neighborhoods that are more so poor, have different racial and ethnicities in those neighborhoods, which is not a very optimal uses of space. Because in my belief, if you need to use space optimally, it's got to be optimally balanced towards people, which kind of goes back to generalization E, balancing trade-offs of using space. And that's what environmental justice is preventing that. And then ultimately going back to the question, how has physical geography in Michigan made this optimization space easier or more difficult? I said more difficult because we are losing dunes. We're losing dunes to erosion. We are even seeing bad erosion due to impervious surfaces. Even here on campus, the Ravines Trail right behind us we are losing a lot of sediments, and we're seeing a lot of erosion back there because of impervious surfaces. And ultimately, by having impervious surfaces, we are not optimizing the land or the space because we are eroding it. And we also have improper uses on farmlands where we are having mass production farms where we don't really care for the land. We just care about yield outputs, meaning that we are having slaughterhouses, large-scale animal farms, which ultimately puts a lot of chemicals into our water supplies. And also, on top of that, maize, soybeans, asparagus productions are inputting chemicals into groundwater and ultimately go into our water supplies as well. One of the other things is climate. When I was thinking about climate was winters, where we get a lot of snow, we get a lot of ice. It's really hard to optimize our space when we face these kind of climate issues. When we are facing climate change, and we can't really optimize the space or land uses when we are seeing these kind of events in climate. And then also protection of our natural space through policy, through environmental issues, by protecting natural areas for animals, tree species, and we can't really optimize that space because we are protecting it for environmental reasons, species reasons, fauna and flora reasons. So it's really hard to optimize that kind of space if it's protected environmentally. And then we're going back to the home rule situation, where a really good example of that is the 40th project they're doing just west of campus here. And just that kind of home rule, it's really hard to optimize your space if we have different ideologies per township, per county in the state. And we have different preferences of what we want to do with land uses. The second part of the question is regional optimization impacted by time or time periods. I say time periods because of new urbanism. New urbanism is a trend kind of like, and generation, just like baby boomers and millennials. We prefer different things. We have different trends that we believe in. We have different tastes. Like especially in new urbanism compared to city beautification movement in the 1900s and 1950s, where we see suburbanization. We see those trends really optimizing those land uses, and they're really impacted by time. And then I also put right the farm legislation because as a optimization that is impacted by policy, which is ultimately a time period because that affects people over a time period. So now moving on to question 2. Climate, soils, vegetation, transition evolve in Michigan about the same latitude. Elaborate on this phenomenon. Now, I put these maps side by side by each other because they really show certain trends with each other. Vegetation, soils, and climate all correlate at the same latitude. And the example that I'm going to use here is north central Michigan right here in each map. You can really see the correlation at that latitude, those latitudes, in terms of the simplicity of what is in that land area, and what happens in that land area. So we see in the red here, this is a certain climate type in red here. And then you see it in purple, it covers most of north central Michigan, which is the Spodosols soil order. And then the type of vegetation is mostly pines, spruces, etc. in that north central area. And I do believe that climate is a factor for both of these, which it makes sense that all three of these do correlate with each other because climate helps make these types of soils. It helps make these type of vegetations based on what happens there climate-wise. So it is really kind of actually a really cool phenomenon to see that these soils, this vegetation that we see, and the climate that we see do transition into the same area. And we can see a really good example of that in UP as well, kind of south central UP, that we see the same type of vegetation, pines, spruces, and then we see a different type of soil, hissy soils, covering most of the area and actually comprising most of the pine area too. And then this part of climate where we see the line, even just on this side here where we see a little purple, we're seeing a little bit yellow kind of dip in there. So maybe that type of soil adapts to that type of climate rather than this type of climate and this type of climate. So those are kind of the transitions that we see in climate, vegetation, and soil in Michigan. Moving on to 3. Above a certain volume of snow becomes firn and then ice. Ice exhibits a certain plasticity. What is this plasticity? What does it translate into when applied to glaciers? Which glacier landscapes are a byproduct of this plasticity or lack of plasticity below a certain ice thickness? And as stated, snow becomes firn and then ice over time. Glaciers lose strength and begin to flow at 200 feet or above 200 feet. And glaciers at that point and above are always flowing no matter what. Unless they go below that point, they stay still. Kind of like the jello and bucket effect that you explained in your PowerPoint. Glacial movement goes on a path of, always goes on a path of least resistance. And then plasticity ultimately translates into movement of the glaciers. It helps move the glaciers because of this effect that we see at 200 feet and above. And glacial landscapes are a byproduct of deposited rocks in sediments over time. They can also create erosion to the land and create landscapes of glacial melt, which ultimately Great Lakes were created that way. Lack of plasticity below the ice thickness can create vegetation on top of the glacier and then ultimately insulate the glacier, which we can see that in possibly our groundwater supplies. That can answer some of our groundwater supplies. And I found this really cool chart on Google Images. I just typed in what happens after a glacier. And this really cool chart popped up, which really explains what happens during a glacier and post-glacier. So the glacier is coming in. We're seeing the tilt coming in, the delta, and these moraines coming in on the side here, and the crevasses on the side. Which, really, if you take a look at the glacier here, it makes sense. It correlates very much with the post-glacial valley that you see here. You see all the till made here by the movement of the glacier through the valley. And then you see the moraines created over time because of the crevasses and the movement of sediments in those crevasses. And we are also seeing this lake type thing on top of the glacier right here as well. And because we are seeing this, we get the landscape here created. And this is kind of a side view of what happens in that valley. We see the glacier move through, erodes through, and creates this valley right here. So that is the basic background on glaciers and glacier movement and the plasticity of glaciers. To the last question, how and why do mineral resources spatially differentiate between the western upper peninsula and the lower peninsula in Michigan? In the upper peninsula, we mostly see iron ore and copper and older types of minerals in the upper peninsula, where in the lower peninsula we see limestone, kind of cheaper material, and also newer rock material minerals in the Lower Peninsula. And both the Upper Peninsula and the Lower Peninsula, both of these minerals were created by glacial movement, but they also had differentiated in different processes. In the Upper Peninsula, in the western part, is created by, is formed through igneous and metamorphic processes, where in the Lower Peninsula is created by sedimentary processes. And because of these effects, it was through the mid-continent rift system, especially in the Upper Peninsula, where we see the rift system moving, and also the movement of water ultimately helped create copper iron ore from volcanic materials, which also in the Upper Peninsula helped create the divide between copper and iron in the Upper Peninsula. And through the rock layers, we see that over time there's a loss of sediment, like the Precambrian rock layer and the Pennsylvanian rock layers. They deplete and then they fill up again, and that's how each rock layer is created. And that is also based on glacial drift movement after rifting, the mid-continent rift system. And really all the layers, rock layers in Michigan are close to the surface. I think as you mentioned in your PowerPoint, they're as far down as 3 miles, which isn't really that deep. And we can, in that chart you showed on that PowerPoint too, it shows that it was kind of a divot, a valley in the rock layers. And we see the older rock layers over here, the newer rock layers over here, which ultimately was caused by glacial drift. And it was created through that. So, and that is how mineral resources differentiate in the Upper Peninsula, in the Lower Peninsula, and in the how and why processes. And ultimately, we see in the mineral resources, the Upper Peninsula is a older mineral resource compared to the Lower Peninsula, whereas a newer mineral resource, which that is why I think makes the Upper Peninsula mineral-wise much more valuable than the Lower Peninsula in terms of mining the materials. So I think that is the completion of my midterm exam. And it was a really interesting experience, kind of something new that I had to do, get outside my comfort zone. So thank you, and I'll see you later. Thanks. Bye.